Money Radio, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. It is a pleasure to welcome Jeremy Joss. He has spent some 20-plus years as an executive in some of the world's leading financial institutions, Schroders, Citigroup, Rothschild, and he has also written a book, Dinosaur Derivatives and Other Trades. Dinosaur Derivatives and Other Trades. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Sinclair, for having me on the show.
So I'd love to buy, say, a stegosaur or a T-Rex, maybe even better than that, a megalodon. That would be cool. But I know that there just aren't many of them out there, which I guess just makes them all the more valuable, correct?
So look, I mean, you sort of hit the nail on the head. I mean, my book is a funny bunch of stories about different concepts in finance, and you know the first one, and which is the origin of the title of the book, Dinosaur Derivatives, is about this contract to buy a megalodon. And you know, for the benefit of your listeners, a megalodon is a prehistoric shark that's been extinct for millions of years. So this is a contract to buy something that doesn't really exist, And you just said it. I mean, the question is, could such a contract ever have any value? And obviously, if you'd asked me that 25 years ago when I first went into finance, my answer would have been, no, that's absurd. But actually, that's not really my experience in finance. And my experience is that all sorts of complex contracts where the underlying value is very questionable turn out, in certain market circumstances, to have significant value, or at least we attribute value to them. And that's what that whole sort of funny story is about, really.
And it really is a funny story. You create an auction place in Manhattan where they're trading options on megalodons.
Right.
And, of course, the bidding goes up and up and up, and it all gets a bit absurd until you start to think, well, okay, let's substitute megalodons for, say, tulips or for, let's say, CDOs.
Yeah, no, so that's exactly the point. I mean, the story is absurd, but then I go on to try and analyze it and say, hey, look, what's so different between this? When you break it all down, between all sorts of assets. I mean, gold, for a starter, right? I mean, gold today has no utilitarian benefit to us whatsoever. And yet, bizarrely, in risk-averse times, investors pile into gold when it's just chunks of metal sitting in the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England or wherever it is. So gold has all sorts of market value but no real intrinsic value. But then the same happens in all sorts of securities markets. I mean, I think we've got another sort of Internet 2 bubble going on at the moment with social media stocks. There's no way you can justify the current price of social media stocks by reference to their underlying fundamental intrinsic value. But people will buy them at these incredible prices. Same with CDOs. The same thing we saw in the credit crisis. These hugely inflated prices for certain bonds that just didn't reflect the underlying risk associated with these bonds. And what we're really talking about is what's called the whole school of behavioral finance, which is really saying, well, markets are not always that rational. They're not always that efficient. And there are these psychological and group psychological factors that drive up value. Indeed,
though, it brings up a very important point in finance, the idea of value. What is value? And it's easy to point out the price of something, but what's the real value of it?
Right, and so that is what I'm playing with, and in one sense, I mean, again, if you take that example of the media stocks, what is fundamental value? Well, the fundamental value of a stock is the discounted value of its future cash flows, right? And we don't need to go into too much mathematics, but those are the sort of stocks which Warren Buffett likes to look for. He wants to look for these stocks that continually generate real cash flow and they have real fundamental value. But what we see periodically, and more often than a lot of people think, are these dislocations where the market value really cannot be linked to that fundamental discounted value of future cash flows. And so the market value of an asset in all sorts of cases is just quite often different from the underlying utility of the asset. I mean, look, diamonds is another example. I mean, what utility do diamonds really have? And yet there's a De Beers cartel which props up their price. There's this deep body of brokers that provides liquidity to diamonds, and there's this sort of something in our psyche, group psyche, which makes every young bride want a diamond, and that props up their market price, and that's sort of what I'm playing with.
And doesn't this, of course, lead to bubbles?
And it does, and so that's right. And look, as I said, there's been a lot of more and more serious academic work done on this by behavioral finance guys, by people like Schiller, to say that these groupthink aspects of value do tend to create bubbles and actually create them much more regularly than the efficient market theory wants us to believe, which is not to say that we don't need markets, right? But we need to be realistic about actually the level of rationality of these markets.
We hear that this type of trading sometimes provides liquidity, perhaps is an answer to risk in the markets. Is that so?
Well, look, liquidity is very important, right? And lots of capital wouldn't flow to businesses that need it if there isn't liquidity in stock markets, in bond markets, and in foreign exchange markets. So liquidity is absolutely fundamental, and that's partly what the invention of stock markets did. It created liquidity in corporate capital. And I actually think since the credit crisis, one of the problems we've had is there was such a reaction to the bubble that a lot of liquidity in certain credit markets dried up, and plenty of mid-market companies haven't been able to get the capital they actually need. So we do need liquidity, but the critical thing is that liquidity can also can get out of hand, and it can create bubbles, and there can be groupthink in it. And so that's the dichotomy.
One of the things that we seem to overlook many times in finance and in the marketplace is the idea of risk, and yet many times we try to deal with it. That's another great story in the book that really goes back to biblical times. And I have to say, I never really thought of this story as an economic story, but it's the story of Joseph in Egypt. Yeah.
Well, look, so what's that about? I mean, I took the story of Joseph, who of course foresaw seven good years and then 7 bad years, and he was given this prophecy by God about it. And I didn't really want to focus on the religious aspect of the story, but it's typical of the book. I just wanted to take this story and show what it tells us about sort of modern finance, and it is a very economic story. I mean, for a start, it shows us that booms and busts are as old as the world, right? But that's just a starter. But what it's also about is risk, because you see, the most interesting thing about that story, without going into a lot of detail, is that actually at the end of it, during the bad times, I mean, Joseph, along with the Pharaoh, sort of cornered. He had this huge stockpile of corn, and he then started selling it for cash, and then for land, and then for people's animals, and then for labor. And he effectively cornered the whole Fertile Crescent. He cornered the whole then known world. And what I wanted to say was, in the end, Joseph was a sort of insider dealer. He'd been given this sort of extraordinary tip by God about the future. And
it's about as insider trading as you can get.
Right, exactly. Because it wasn't just a sort of possible tip. This was the word of God. If you want to take the story at its face, this is the word of God. So he knew the future. And what I wanted to show is that when you actually know the future, of course, you sort of circumvented risk entirely, and you will be able to take over the world. You can bet everything on that outcome, precisely because of your level of certainty. And the extraordinary thing about the biblical story is that's actually what happens. He builds up this long position of corn in the good times, and then effectively uses it to take over the then known world in the bad times. So I just wanted to say it's just a lovely way of turning the story to show how it gives us insights actually into the nature of risk and certainty in economics.
And you do a really fine job, I mean, of telling stories to examine ideas such as what is value, what is risk, what is uncertainty. We hear terms like this all the time when it comes to finance, but then to go back and see some of these stories and relate them to these ideas, it just made for an intriguing book.
Right, and that was sort of, my point. I wanted to take these big concepts in finance. You said, risks or ownership or money, fraud, and give a sort of philosophical insight into what they really mean, but do it through stories. And stories I felt was very important, partly because to me, having worked in the industry for a long time, finance is a sort of fiction in itself. Finances don't really deal with the real economy. They're dealing with these notes, these securities, which themselves are just reflections or mirror images of the underlying economy. So the whole of finance has this fictional element about it. And so I wanted to try and capture that by explaining these ideas through accessible and fun stories. So that was really the origin of that. Look, some of the stories are true. Some of them are stories of ancient stories of old. Some are totally apocryphal that I made up. But none of them should be taken too seriously. I suppose the main thing is most of them tell you how not to do finance, really. But yeah, the stories is an important part of the book.
But it really turns out to be a different way of thinking about finance. Sometimes we get kind of bogged down in the numbers of finance.
Well, that's right. I think you can miss the wood for the trees, and I think even a lot of the academic work. And I've studied a lot of academic work. I studied a lot of economics and philosophy, both as graduate and undergraduate. A lot of the academic work can get very bogged down in detail and miss the big picture. And it can get very ideological as well, and be taken off in a right wing or radically left wing direction. And again, that often just misses the actual reality of the daily practice of finance.
And you talk about some of the most basic building blocks in finance, contracts, as a legal fiction.
Yeah, well, that's sort of talking about what really is a financial instrument, and what I wanted to say is that if you look at the history of the development of financial instruments, they're usually there to sort of solve a regulatory problem, and the best example, as I give, is the old prohibition on usury, which was an old biblical prohibition, then it became a part of Christian doctrine, became part of Muslim doctrine. Then you shouldn't lend to someone on interest.
Basically, every religion says you should not.
Right. Well, certainly of the sort of Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, they said you shouldn't do that, and which is a fine idea, but it just doesn't work economically, right? Because it's not really possible to lend to people without charging interest. So what developed, if you actually look at the development of a lot of financial instruments, they really developed as a way of arbitraging around that problem of creating loans, but things that didn't look like loans. For example, leases. Lease. Instead of lending someone cash and charging interest, you lend them an asset and charge them a rent. But it achieves the same effect. And so, lease is a good example of really a financial instrument that's a legal fiction. It's really a piece of debt, but hiding as something else.
Or the story of the donkey traders. That was a great one. Give us the quick story of the donkey traders.
Well, the donkey traders, I just said, what happens if one guy buys a donkey for $50, and then a year later he sells the donkey for $60, right? Back to the original seller. And I said, if you think of that, it looks like two trades, right? It looks like buying a donkey and selling a donkey, but actually what that is a loan collateralized against a donkey, because effectively one guy has given the other guy $50. The other guy has then paid back $60, which is $50 plus 20% interest. And the donkey was just collateral for the loan. And so there's another example of two trades which act as a legal fiction but replicate all the cash flows of a loan. And the incredible thing is this is used regularly. It's used in all sorts of things. It's used in what's called the repo market, in stock lending. That's how brokers lend against stock. They effectively buy and sell it between each other with a small markup representing the interest, and the underlying stocks are just the collateral for these loans. So again, that was another nice example of how you can replicate a loan in a mirror image, in a legal fiction of these two trades.
And you've also given us a background of not only the original pawnbrokers, but also Tier 1 capital under the Basel Agreement for the largest banks in the world. Hang on just a moment, and we will continue the conversation with Jeremy Joss. Just a fascinating book, and it's entitled Dinosaur Derivatives and Other Trades. Dinosaur Derivatives by Jeremy Joss. We'll continue in just a moment. Money Radio, thank you so much for joining us today. We're talking with Jeremy Joss, author of a new book, Dinosaur Derivatives and Other Trades. It's just a fascinating book, and you use a lot
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed reading it. It was a different approach to real financial issues, value, uncertainty, the idea of a contract and ownership, and what is money. And in this world these days, in a Bitcoin world where we're looking at cyber cash, our concepts of what money really is and value really is being challenged almost daily.
Yeah. The money story is also, it was one of the most fun ones for me to write. I mean, your viewers should realize, if they don't already, that today 95% of our money are just electronic blips on their computer-based accounts. There's actually very little hard cash money left in the system. And that's an incredible revolution that's happened over the last 20 years. And so I wanted to tell a funny story about, someone who could hack into the central bank sort of money systems. And it's very hard, but it's theoretically possible that could happen. And I think if we normally think about that, we probably think of like a James Bond movie where some guy some baddie hacks into the system and he's got 10 minutes to download all this cash. But I wanted to turn it on its head and said, look, what if our baddie doesn't actually want to steal money? He wants to actually give everybody money, which, of course, he might have the ability to do with the right sort of virus. And that, you wake up tomorrow morning and everybody finds their accounts populated with lots more numbers, money. And what's the effect of that? And, of course, the effect of it is probably inflation, very bad inflation. And so it goes to the whole issue of monetary easing and quantitative easing, which is a very relevant current subject. And I wanted to show that in many ways the beneficence of this guy in the story, he did more damage than had he been a real crook. So anyway, again, I was just playing with the fact that money today is in one sense very efficient as an electronic means, but it's also highly vulnerable.
Interesting that you say just playing, because a lot of this goes back to the idea of game theory.
Right. Well, some of it does. I mean, look, game theory definitely, I think, touches on actually some of the stock market patterns of behavior that we've been previously talking about in terms of value, because game theory is all about how group patterns of thinking and behavior develop. I mean, great game theory is relevant to some of these issues, yeah. And
in fact, you kind of wrap it up with a little bit of a computerized game, if you will.
Right. I was watching my kids play a lot of computer games about a sort of group economic game that I develop and about guys effectively seeding new economies and then through these special securities and then trading these securities among the kids. But the real point of that story is just to show that actually many of the issues in the book, whether it's everything from value to certainty to money to fraud to regulation, they're all actually linked. It's a linked chain of ideas, which when you look at the way I structure that game, I try to show that link.
And is the link working now?
So that's the $1 million question. Look, I absolutely believe that there's no such thing as getting rid of booms and busts. I think they're absolutely intrinsic to any sort of capitalist system. And frankly, if the system isn't capitalist, at least in some way, it's not really a system. So booms and busts will always be there. And I think, frankly, as I say, we've already got a new bubble in social media stocks. Having said that, the U.S. economy has turned around in a very impressive way. I mean, GDP growth is good now, unemployment is low, inflation is low, and the banking system is in very good shape. There are about 6,000 banks in America.
Somehow or another, it all seems to work, and we advance as a part of it. But to understand it, you probably need to understand the value of a megalodon.
Right. So my point is, we certainly turn things around at the moment, but will things go wrong again in the future? Absolutely.
Jeremy Joss, Dinosaur Derivatives. This was just an intriguing book. Fun read. Dinosaur Derivatives and Other Trades by Jeremy Joss, Josse. Dinosaur Derivatives. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on the show.